well, here it is. For 3 years now, I've been talking about the Castlevania series of computer games. I've spoken about every console game, I've even dabbled a little bit into the handheld games, but finally, here we are at the end of this journey. For a brief time there, Castlevania was Konami's golden goose. In between 1986's Castlevania for the NES and then Super Castlevania for the SNES in 1991, Castlevania couldn't be beaten. Even the handheld games couldn't be stopped. The first game, Castlevania The Adventure on the Game Boy, tore up trees. It was the first Game Boy game ever to sell 1 million units. 1997's Symphony of the Night did do okay, but it took an awfully long time to get there. Generally speaking, sales were inconsistent after Super 4. By the turn of the millennium, kids were into Xbox and Halo and Tony Hawk's. Gaming was a lot less niche and it was becoming increasingly more mainstream. More to the point, publishers demanded far more in return for their investment. Small little passion projects made by dedicated little teams, they were just becoming less and less sustainable. Konami closed 2 studios in the early 2000s and they were becoming increasingly risk-averse about where they spent their money. Dracula may have kept rising from the grave, but it was Konami who kept having to pay for it. Going into the PS2 era, I don't think anybody expected these games to be the death of Castlevania. So, what's a Castlevania? I am going to pretend like you haven't seen any other videos about this game series. So Castlevania is a horror-themed action platform series where you play as a member of the family Belmont and you run around fighting skeletons and ghosts and stuff. The central conceit is that every 100 years or so, Count Dracula, the Count Dracula, rises from his grave, gathers together all his little creatures of the night and attempts to take over the world. At least I assume that's his plan, because every single time he does this, a member of the Belmont clan turns up and they're like, "Oi, face, get back in that coffin." It must be really annoying for old Vladdy there to lie in his coffin for 100 years, getting ready to take over the world, and then his time comes, he gets up, he gets all his lads around him, have a few cans, get his big coat on, ready to go out and take over the world, and then just some kid he's never met before just turns up and he's like... I like to imagine him just sometimes lying there in his coffin like, I really thought I had it this time, you know? I really thought this was going to be my century. Or maybe like the Grim Reaper's in there like, oh, you'll get him next time, pal. Anyway, the strength of that repeating motif has meant that each game can actually afford to be pretty different. A different historical setting, a different graphical presentation, different gameplay styles. In fact, I think the real strength of this series is that each game was approached by a completely different creative team. And so we get to Koji Igarashi. Iga joined Konami in like the mid-1990s. He came on partway through the production of Rondo of Blood, and he then went on to be the co-producer of Symphony of the Night. Iga rose through the ranks at Konami and essentially got himself a role where he was in charge of unifying the entire Castlevania franchise. This basically made him the Kevin Feige of Castlevania. I'm not entirely sure if Castlevania ever needed a Kevin Feige-like character. I'm not entirely sure really if I believe in the idea of having one person in control of an entire franchise's tone and feel. Actually, what I liked about those early games was the fact that they were kind of crazy and all over the place, and you know, they didn't necessarily always fit together, but each game was fun and I could enjoy it on its own merit. I don't think sanitizing it or tidying it up was ever really something that was important to me as a consumer of these games. But then also, I can understand from Konami's perspective, they certainly weren't about to throw good money after bad. There was a planned Dreamcast game which was cancelled in the year 2000 just as the PlayStation 2 was launching in Japan. And so Konami went all in on the PS2 being the console that would bring Castlevania into the next generation. Iga had said that Konami had no interest in making 2D games anymore. Symphony of the Night, although it is appreciated now, actually got some pretty nasty reviews at the time because people complained about it being old-fashioned, using 2D on a console where the expectation was all the games were going to be 3D. Like I've been saying, Konami were just not willing to take another gamble with Castlevania. If Castlevania was going to be a hit, then Konami would chase what was popular. The PS2 was an easy decision to make, being that it was the market leader, and so Castlevania was going to be reinvented as a slick 60 FPS action game specifically inspired by Devil May Cry. The first challenge that Iga sat down with was the timeline. The first Castlevania game on the NES is set in 1691. This is the game about Simon Belmont. The second game is set 5 years later, but the third game is set 200 years earlier. That's the game about Trevor Belmont. Subsequent games then established that 100-year cadence. It looked like they were going to tick-tock a new game at either end of that timeline, but then spin on 10 years and Konami had just crammed more and more games into that established timeline. Iga saw the 100-year pattern as a problem that needed to be fixed, so he essentially came up with a double-pronged approach to open up that timeline. In 2003, Konami released Aria of Sorrow, which was set in 2035, and Lament of Innocence, which is set in 1094. The intention here was to give that timeline plenty more air because 1094 was going to establish the beginning of the story, but we'd already had a Game Boy game that did that, so Iga decided to retcon this game, and others, out of canon. Not cool, man. Not cool. Anyway, Lament of Innocence is the very first Castlevania game. This is the origin of the entire mythology. This is the origin of the Belmont clan, the origin of Count Dracula, the whip, the wall meat, the whole shebang. Sometimes, to get to the end, you have to go back to the start. Koji Igarashi was given a massive team. It was nearly 5 times the size of any team he'd had before, and it featured a cross-section of Konami All-Stars, people like illustrator Ayami Kojima and musician Mishiro Yamane. In fact, his team was full of collaborators from all of his previous Castlevania games. 2 of the senior programmers on the project had been working on Castlevania since the 16-bit games. A fair chunk of the environment and creature design team had worked on the previous 2 Silent Hill games, so in terms of a team, this seemed like it was off to a good start. Lament of Innocence is about Leon Belmont. If you've seen the Netflix anime, then you probably noticed him mentioned in that show as the founder of the Belmont clan. Leon was a powerful man in his life. He was landed gentry, he was a knight, he was a crusader. When Leon learns that his wife-to-be has been kidnapped by a vampire called Walter Bernhard, he leaves it all behind to go find her. In order to do this, he ends up forfeiting his barony, all of his lands, all of his money, all of his privilege. He loses it all so that he can go and rescue his missus. And I think this is really what the whole excommunicated from the church thing means, which they hint at in the anime. But anyway, choosing poverty and integrity to go and hunt vampires makes Leon an absolute legend. Leon is gifted a magical whip by a hermit who lives in a forest, and off he pops. Walter Bernhard's castle is divided into 5 areas, all of which are linked by a central hub room. You can approach these areas in any order you want. This isn't that common in Castlevania games, and actually I don't think this is super common in games in general, but I really like this idea. unlike the games immediately before and after it, Lament of Innocence doesn't have any RPG elements, so there's no XP, there's no leveling, nothing like that. This really helps to keep this gameplay style balanced, so you're not punished for going to the wrong area first. Each area has things which make it unique, like its own visual identity, its own unique enemy types. It even has its own unique sound, and there is a big boss at the end of each of these areas. There's a giant Medusa head, a succubus, all the hits. Some of these areas are kind of more puzzle forward, some of these areas promote platforming. All of them have their own secret hidden areas and upgrades, so that does help to promote that backtracking and exploration vibe. You'll find a key, for instance, in the catacombs, which opens a door in the gardens, and so on and so forth. Of all the Castlevania games that do this, this is the one I most enjoy running around in. The core gameplay stays very true to that classic Castlevania formula, but there's just enough new stuff to bring it into the 2000s. So you're exploring a spooky castle and you're whipping skeletons, but now you've got things like combos, a block button and a dodge roll. Killing enemies and whipping candlesticks will drop money and hearts. Hearts, as in all other Castlevania games, are not to refill your life bar, but they are ammo for your sub-weapons. So where square and triangle are for light and heavy attacks with the whip, pressing circle will let Leon use a secondary sub-weapon. Sub-weapons include things like a throwing knife, an axe, a cross, a crystal, and of course your classic bottle of holy water. Now, this is all well and good, but to deepen this just a little bit more, each boss drops an orb when it dies. This is actually no different from the first Castlevania game, but the difference here is that each orb will change your sub-weapon's attack. So one sub-weapon can have up to 6 different attacks depending on how many orbs you've collected. That means there's 42 potential sub-weapon attacks. This makes the combat really unique, and this is one of the reasons I enjoy this game, because it just makes it so much fun to hang around and experiment. Once Leon has cleared all 5 of the castle's areas, a secret 6th area opens up and we enter the game's final act. The big finale has a really great twist, which I'm not sure I want to ruin here. Some spoilers, but Walter Bernhard isn't the one pulling the strings here.
It's Dracula.
It turns out that Leon has been manipulated this entire time. His actions have been guided by the man who would then become Count Dracula. In fairness, the story cribs a fair bit from Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, but that doesn't bother me at all because that film is rad. Angry at his betrayal and at his manipulation, Leon swears that he and his family will forever hunt Dracula and his night creatures.
The Belmont clan will hunt the night!
The origins of the famous vampire killer whip, which it turns out is imbued with a human soul and forged with that anger, explains why it's so powerful when used against the undead. And of course, it cements that weapon forever into the Belmont legacy. Man's girlfriend goes missing, so he instigates a 1,000-year war with the Prince of Darkness. Pretty standard stuff. This is peak Castlevania for me. I mean, actually, this is peak for any kind of game for me. There's just enough detail and there's just enough stuff here that the game can still be really focused. There are things like hidden bosses and special items which help to incentivize backtracking, but there's not that much. It's not flabby. I've read that Konami were really risk averse and were pretty parsimonious when it came to the budget for these PS2 games. And so I think Iga's team spent the smart money here. They focused on getting out a tight, detailed little action game which concentrated on just doing a few things really well. And that was all reflected in the sales. This game came out Christmas 2003, so it was going up against KOTOR, Prince of Persia, Sands of Time, Tony Hawk's Underground, and still, it smashed it. Lament of Innocence was the best-selling Castlevania game since the first Castlevania game. That made it the second best-selling game in the entire franchise. It's important to remember here, before you jump into the comments about Symphony of the Night, is at this point in time, Symphony of the Night had only sold about 700,000 units worldwide. It wasn't the 1 million seller that it is nowadays. Those figures are all pretty much from the re-releases on Xbox and Steam, which came many years later. Reviews for the game were all relatively favourable. Michiru Yamane's music is often very highly spoken of, and it is awesome music, and it's all brand new. She didn't rely on any of the old school Castlevania themes for this. There's no vampire killer, there's no bloody tears, and the reason for that is because there isn't a whip yet. There isn't a Dracula. It looked like the plan was working. Lament of Innocence had absolutely put Castlevania back on the map, so Konami did what Konami do best, and they went off half-cocked with a rushed sequel. A big chunk of the Lament team went straight into working on Curse of Darkness. Those who didn't went to go and work on Nano Breaker, which now makes me really want to play that. I guess I'll add it to the Trello. The story of Curse of Darkness takes place 3 years after Castlevania III on the NES. After spending all that time gassing up the timeline, I have no idea why Iga would pull a stunt like this. Apparently he just really liked Castlevania 3, he said that he played it loads in college, and he just thought it would be cool to make a direct sequel, so go off, champ. At the end of Castlevania 3, Trevor, Cypher and Alucard kill Count Dracula. But what we're told is, at the moment of his death, big old Vlad lets out some mighty cry and curses the landscape, which makes medieval Europe even more of a shithole than it already was. This is kind of similar to the setup for Castlevania 2, except we're not tracking down pieces of Dracula's body this time. Curse of Darkness is about Hector, a Devil Forge master and previously one of Dracula's henchmen. Hector turns his back on his past ways and he retires to the country. That is until his old workmate Isaac murders his wife. So off he sets to the ruins of Castle Dracula to hunt down Isaac and to get his revenge. If you've seen that great Netflix animated show, then you'll probably recognise the names Hector and Isaac. You'll probably recognise the term Devil Forge Master. Seasons 2 and 3 of that show took a lot of inspiration from Curse of Darkness, which makes a lot of sense in that Season 1 was so heavily based on Castlevania 3. In case you haven't, I'll give you the cliff notes. Devil forging is essentially a form of necromancy. In the show it's like really metal, but in the game it's actually a little more abstract. Hector can summon creatures which are called innocent devils. They're essentially an extension of the familiars from Symphony of the Night, where Alucard could summon like little creatures to fight alongside him. Hector's innocent devils are similar to that, but they can also evolve depending on how many baddies you've defeated and with what weapon. So I guess that's the whole like necromancy forge mastery angle, turning the souls of your defeated enemies into more powerful creatures. I think the Pokemon inspiration is really obvious, but also I think it's worth remembering that Konami are the brand behind Yu-Gi-Oh! And they had been releasing cards and games based on that for years at this point. So it's no real surprise that capturing, raising and evolving your own monsters eventually made its way into Castlevania. The combat largely follows on from what was present in Lament of Innocence, with Hector able to lock on, dodge, parry, string together combos, all that stuff. Instead of using the whip, Hector can now use all kinds of different weapons, but there are no sub-weapons. So your IDs essentially are your sub-weapons here. So you still collect hearts, but now they're ammo for your devil's abilities. On top of this, there's also a mechanic for stealing. And this sounds silly, but it's actually an important part of the game. Stealing from low-level enemies will just get you like small amounts of gold and stuff like that, but high-level enemies and even bosses all have rare items that can only be stolen, and you need them for crafting the best weapons in the game. Because, yeah, there's also crafting. There's like 60 weapons and like 40 odd bits of armor that can only be acquired by crafting them. On top of that, Curse of Darkness really leans back into all the RPG stuff from Symphony of the Night. So XP and leveling, that's all back. Damage types, damage reduction, all that stuff. Plus there's stat buffs and things like that from rings and accessories which you find by exploring the place. All of that on top of leveling and evolving your innocent devils. Oh, and lest we forget the chairs. There are 24 unique chairs in Curse of Darkness, and when you find them, Hector can sit in them. And then there is a special hidden chair room in one of the maps where you can see all the chairs that you found, and if you find all the chairs, it unlocks a final secret chair. Now personally, I don't care for any of the RPG stuff. I don't go in for grinding. I don't care for any of that. But finding chairs, chef kiss. Quality game, mate. Joking aside, this is all madly complex for a game from 2005. We've swung from this tight, focused action game to something so much deeper with so many overlapping systems. As a way to compensate for all that complexity, Curse of Darkness is a far more linear game. You're almost railroaded into these corridors and rooms filled with enemies. For me, this isn't actually a problem. This feels more like that original Castlevania vibe, and to be honest, I like that, so that's cool. You can go back and revisit previous areas. It's possible to move around because you want to find all the stuff, but because of the really long level design and Hector's slightly annoying movement speed, you might not want to. Like any classic Castlevania game, the back third of this is pretty much a grind as you just run up to the final fight. By the time you catch up to Isaac, in typical Castlevania fashion, Hector finds out that there is a bigger game at play. Turns out that this creepy dude who you met a few times, it turns out that he's been planning on bringing Dracula back from the dead this entire time. And apparently everyone is really surprised by this. Like, this is madly out of character for this creepy little troll. It's pretty much the exact same plot as Symphony of the Night, which is kind of surprising when you compare it to Lament of Innocence, which seemed to go out of its way not to lean so heavily on previous games. So yeah, as you might expect, you fight the Grim Reaper and then you fight Dracula. Sure, what I do really like is Dracula's second form. Dracula has a second form in nearly all of the Castlevania games, and the idea behind this is once you've defeated Dracula's body, you're then fighting like the curse personified. So it's always this gnarly, demonic version of Dracula. The N64 games have the absolutely wildest demon forms, but Curse of Darkness's final form I think is up there with the best of them. Of course, you win the day, Hector puts Dracula back in the ground, and then he goes off to live happily ever after. It's a little pinch of Simon's Quest, a big heavy pinch of Symphony of the Night, all served up in a relatively janky 3D action game. That's not to put this game down, because any lack of polish is made up for with an absolute ton of heart, and that is exactly what I love most about this franchise. During the press junket for Curse of Darkness, Iga was riding high on enthusiasm. He said how there was these new Castlevania games coming out for next-gen platforms, there was a game announced for the Wii, he said that Paul W.S. Anderson was working on a Castlevania movie. I wish he was talking about setting games in the future where Dracula's a computer virus. He was talking about a game where you get to play as Rootin' Tootin' Quincy Morris from the Bram Stoker novel. I love this enthusiasm. A futuristic Castlevania game is something I've honestly wanted for so long. I'm just sad he never got the chance, because behind the scenes it really wasn't all wine and roses. Developing for 3D had been a massive challenge for Iga. He'd never wanted to make 3D games, and he was never really comfortable working with teams of this size. And when it came to the sales, those numbers just weren't helping him out. Curse of Darkness sold 420,000 units. That's far from the worst sales for a Castlevania game. In fact, that's somewhere in the middle. Castlevania had never been a franchise that pulled up trees, but if you think about the production size and the budget, Konami could get just as many sales from a GBA game, which was made by 8 people, or one of the DS games, which came out earlier that same year. 2005 was the year the Xbox 360 launched. The PlayStation 3 was still a year off, but the next generation was basically here. Igarashi was already internally pitching for new ideas for Castlevania games. This time it's likely that he was inspired by Santa Monica's God of War. Iga said that he'd played God of War, he loved it, and that also he was kind of jealous of it. He recognised that Sony had given Santa Monica the right amount of budget, but also the right amount of creative freedom to go and make David Jaffa's vision real. He also recognised that Konami had not given him that same level of care or consideration. I've made a video about the gear shift into the 7th console generation and about how it affected smaller teams. The bottom line is that the entire industry pivoted to big projects with big budgets. Small teams working on passion projects just became unsustainable. I don't think Konami chose to end the franchise here, not with Iga opening up the potential for all these new stories in the continuity, but Konami's risk-averse attitude towards a franchise that had never really done that well in Japan anyway, it just pushed it to the bottom of their priority list. Iga spoke many times about how he was never really comfortable working with big teams or making 3D games. So Konami kept him on, and they let him continue working on Castlevania on the DS. They decided that Castlevania was basically a niche title, so then it would be a handheld exclusive for whatever life it had left in it. A lot of the creative team from these 2 PS2 games stayed together for the next few years. They released some really decent handheld games, but there was never another home console game in Konami's Castlevania franchise. Iga's next-gen Castlevania game that he'd mentioned was teased at the 2008 Tokyo Game Show, but nothing after that. Curse of Darkness wasn't the last Castlevania game, but it was the last console game. After that, Castlevania would go to sleep, waiting in vain to be revived again one day in the future. Thank you very much for watching to the end, not just of this video, but of this series. For 3 years now, I've been covering the Castlevania games, and I'm really glad that there are people who come back and enjoy them all the time. So yeah, super grateful. Thank you so much. There's still potential for me to talk about Castlevania in the future. I'm just really glad to have had this whole thing done and to create really a big channel milestone for me. So thank you for sticking around. If you haven't seen any of the previous videos in this series, please check out my previous uploads. If you like Castlevania or spooky games or games from like the 2000s, that's something I very much like to cover here on Stoked, so please go check those out. Big shout out to the channel members who give me a nice little tip at the end of each month. That's madly appreciated. Absolutely love it. If you want to see more of this kind of crazy stuff in future, hit subscribe. I'll see you in a future video. Thank you so much everyone, and have a great Halloween, have a great sound, and I'll see you on the next upload. Ta-da.